Good evening. This evening I want to share this story with you. It was a very eerie experience I had to live through, and even though it was unpleasant for me, I hope you like it. My name is Andre Galvan, originally from Mexico. I've lived and worked here all my life. Back in 2011, I worked as a delivery driver for a very famous burger restaurant. I think it was known throughout the country. I worked from 3 p.m. to 11 p.m., Monday through Saturday. Of course, going to so many addresses, you get to see all kinds of things and deal with very strange or unpleasant people. But nothing paranormal had ever happened to me during my deliveries until that night. I went to an address to make a delivery. It was about 8 p.m., but there was still a bit of daylight left. When I arrived at the location, I honked the motorcycle horn to let them know I had arrived. I got off my motorcycle with the order and waited outside behind a gate that allowed me to see into the front yard. I heard a girl's voice, and indeed, when I turned my gaze to the right side of the yard, there was a girl, about 6 years old, sitting on the ground with her back to me. In front of her were 2 boys around her age as well. The first thing I noticed was that they were twins, even dressed alike. The 3 of them were playing with some toys, sitting on the ground. I don't know what the girl was saying, but when they noticed I was there, the twins turned to look at me. And from that moment, they didn't take their eyes off me. But they weren't smiling or playing with the girl anymore. They were just serious, watching me. Both sitting in the same position, it was impossible to tell them apart. I must confess that I felt somewhat uncomfortable. I know they were just children, but there was something in their gazes that unsettled me and made me nervous. I didn't like how they were watching me, so I stepped back to a point where they couldn't see me, nor could I see them. The little girl kept talking to them as if nothing had happened. I honked the motorcycle horn again to see if someone would come out, and indeed, the children's mother came out immediately. She walked towards the entrance, apologetically asking if I had been there long. I told her I hadn't been there long and not to worry. After that, she asked her daughter why she hadn't told her I had arrived, but the girl replied that she hadn't noticed because she was playing. When I approached to hand over the order, I noticed the girl was still sitting in the same place, but the 2 twins were no longer there. I dared to tell the lady that her other 2 children had seen me but perhaps didn't want to go and inform her because they were playing. At that moment, the lady looked at me with a confused expression. "I don't have any more children. Who are you talking about? Who else did you see?" she replied, somewhat worried. I didn't know what to say at the moment because I was as confused as she was. What I told her was that I saw 2 twins playing with her daughter when I arrived. I asked if perhaps they were neighbors who had come to play with her, but she replied no, that there were no children her daughter's age on that block, and that no one came to play at their house. Her daughter was an only child and only played with her imaginary friends, something her husband and she had gotten used to hearing her talk to herself, saying she had 2 friends who were always with her, but whom they had never seen. I stayed silent. I honestly didn't know what else to say to the poor woman, who looked very scared at that moment. I felt bad for having told her, but at the same time, I knew I had done the right thing because they needed to know that something was playing with their daughter, 2 twins who perhaps were no longer in this world, and whose gazes held a hint of malice. I asked if she was okay before leaving, and she replied that she was and not to worry, that her husband would be back from work soon. After that, she called her daughter inside for dinner, and I left. Believe me, I still have the image of those 2 children in my mind. From the moment I saw them, they gave off a very strange vibe and made me feel nervous and uncomfortable when they stared at me seriously with a cold gaze, a gaze that is not typical of a child. They were certainly something else. This is the only paranormal experience I've had while working as a delivery driver. Of course, other strange things happened to me, and on another occasion, I'll share another story. Until next time. Hello everyone. My name is Maximiliano, but people call me Max. I am a medical student about to finish my degree. However, a few years ago, when I was just starting my university studies, I worked part-time as a delivery driver for a pizzeria. I did this in the evenings and nights because I attended my classes in the mornings. I lasted approximately 4 months in that job, where my task was to deliver pizzas to homes on the motorcycle assigned to me. But now, I'll tell you what made me quit in such a short time. Back then, I was a young man of just 19 years old. I still remember that night. It was about to be 10 p.m. when I received the order to deliver the last pizza of the day. It was in a neighborhood a bit far from the restaurant, and I knew I would get home very late. So, I hurried to get there as quickly as possible, and then be able to do my university assignments. I arrived at the house, which was actually very nice. The front yard had many beautiful plants and flowers. Even though it was somewhat dark, I could still see them by the streetlights. I rang the doorbell, and a male voice responded from inside telling me to come in as the gate wasn't locked. I entered the yard and waited for the man to come out for his pizza and pay me. I stood behind the main door, assuming the man would come out soon since he had realized I had arrived with his order. But a few minutes passed and no one came out. In fact, there was a rather uncomfortable silence for me, as there was no one else in the street, and the house was very quiet as well. I was getting impatient because, as I mentioned, I was in a hurry to get home. So I knocked on the door 3 times, loudly announcing that his pizza had arrived, but no one came out. Then, I felt something touch my ankle. I got scared and jumped back. When I looked down to see what had touched me, I saw a hand coming out through the small pet door. On top of it was the money for the pizza. But what made me drop the pizza and then run away was that the hand was very swollen and very pale. It was the hand of a deceased person. I knew it immediately because I was studying medicine and knew exactly what a lifeless body looked like. I got on the motorcycle and drove back to the restaurant as fast as I could. I was very scared, and my heart wouldn't stop pounding. I felt a lot of adrenaline at that moment. When I arrived, I told the manager what had happened, and he immediately called the police to inform them. It turned out that indeed, when the officers raided that house, they found a horrifying scene inside. Lying at the entrance was the body of an elderly woman, lifeless, and a few meters from her, they also found a dead cat, which was the woman's pet. They also found the empty pizza box on the table, but there was no trace of the killer. He had left no fingerprints. That woman lived alone with her pet, as her story appeared in the media, and the neighbors said she was a very lonely woman. She had no children, and no one ever visited her. Honestly, I felt very sorry for her and how she ended up, but what terrified me the most was that twisted criminal and his sick mind, because I'm sure he enjoyed scaring me by putting the money in the hand of that dead woman and pushing it out through the pet door. I don't know what kind of psychopath you have to be to do something like that, and I don't know what would have happened if I had stayed there any longer. Maybe I would have become one of his victims too. After that, I couldn't continue with that job. I quit and found another one shortly after. But that night is something I will never forget. I carry it with me every day of my life. Hello, community of the horror genre. My name is Edgar. I'm currently 35 years old. But today I want to share with you an anecdote that happened to me when I was 23 and worked as a delivery driver for a pizza restaurant here in Tijuana. That pizzeria closed at 1 a.m. because it was near the city's bar and nightclub area, and they took advantage of the fact that many young people would go there to eat after partying. I didn't have any problems with that. I enjoyed riding my motorcycle in the early morning when everything was quieter outside of that area. And although there were only a few orders at those hours of the night, this is where this macabre experience begins. One night, it was exactly midnight when a call came in. I was at the counter talking with my coworker, who was handling the cash register and taking orders. He took the call and told me there was work. The pizza was ready almost immediately and I left to deliver it. I drove for about 15 minutes until I reached that house, but when I arrived, I thought I had the wrong address because the house looked very neglected and dark, as if it were abandoned. I double-checked the address written down and indeed that was the house, but it didn't seem like anyone was there. I got off the motorcycle and took the pizza. I remember there was a long, dark garage, but it didn't have a gate. You could walk straight to the end where the main door was. But honestly, I was a bit scared to do that because the place was really dark. I took a few steps inside without going all the way to the end of the garage and shouted that the pizza had arrived. A male voice responded from inside the house, simply shouting, "Come in." I stood there for a few seconds observing the surroundings because I didn't trust going all the way in. But then the voice shouted again for me to enter, this time louder and in a deeper tone. I was just about to start walking when I heard a lady speaking to me from the sidewalk. She was a lady with many stray dogs around her, looking somewhat neglected as if she were homeless, but she seemed very conscious. When I walked over to see what she wanted, the first thing she said was not to go into that house. I told her that someone had ordered a pizza and I had to deliver it, but she responded that nobody lived in that house. It's worth mentioning that her dogs started barking at the house, and some backed away as if scared. Meanwhile, the lady told me that the house had been uninhabited for a year since the owner, a 60-year-old man who lived alone but liked young men, had died. People always saw him bringing different young men into his house. But later, he passed away. Honestly, I was stunned. Though at this point, I didn't know if the woman was mentally sound. I swear she spoke with such seriousness that I believed everything she said because her dogs wouldn't stop barking at the house, and she mentioned that her dogs didn't like passing by there as it made them very nervous. I told her that someone had answered from inside. I asked if a new owner was living there, but she replied that I should look closely at the house and its condition. The garage was filled with trash, and it smelled like feces. Then she asked me ironically if I believed anyone would live in that place. I just stared at her, not knowing what to do. She told me it would be better for my own good to leave because there was nobody inside, at least nobody alive. After that, she left with her dogs, and I decided to leave too. I returned to the restaurant with the pizza. My coworker asked why I hadn't delivered it, and I told him what had happened. He said I did the right thing by not going in, that the situation was very strange. Though he was skeptical about there being a ghost, he thought maybe someone wanted to harm me. Anyway, we left it at that. Later that same week, the day after my day off when I came back to work, my coworker at the register told me that the previous day they had called from that house again, and another delivery driver had gone to make the delivery. The manager was at the restaurant, and despite being told what had happened to me, he forced the driver to go. Of course, he told him not to go inside and to wait for the person to come out for their order. The boy had to go, and he returned pale with fear. He told us that he went all the way to the main door, knocked several times, but nobody answered until he heard a man's voice telling him to come in. Of course, the boy didn't go inside, but he stood there by the door. He said the door suddenly opened, but it was very dark inside, and he couldn't see anything. But within seconds, he felt something pulling him inside, though he said it wasn't a person since he didn't see any silhouette of anyone being there. He didn't know what it was, but he managed to run out of there and return to the restaurant almost speechless. The manager filed a police report explaining what had happened. 2 officers went that same night, but evidently the house was abandoned. There was nobody inside, not even any furniture. It was just an abandoned house. I felt so much terror hearing that because I don't know what would have happened if the lady hadn't warned me about what was going on in that place, and I had gone through that door. After that, my coworker kept receiving calls from that house very frequently, but always at midnight. He said it was a man's voice ordering a pizza to the same address, and then hanging up. Of course, no one went to deliver anymore. We simply ignored it. This lasted for several weeks until it finally stopped. We don't know why they called our place or if they also called other places. We also didn't know where the calls were coming from since there was nothing in that house, not even a phone, though the calls came from that address because that number was registered to that address. It was something very terrifying that took me a long time to process, to believe that I had lived through it, because nothing paranormal had ever happened to me at my job or anywhere else. But it did happen. Don't trust anyone. That's the only thing I can tell you. Hello everyone, I am Gilberto and I hope you are all well. I want to share my story, which, even though it happened some time ago, still terrifies me whenever I remember that strange and eerie night. I am from Argentina. Back then, I worked for a Chinese food restaurant as a delivery driver. My shift ended around 11 p.m. since the restaurant closed at midnight, but home delivery orders were accepted until 11. One of those nights I had to deliver an order to a new development in the city where I had never been before since very few houses were inhabited. All the other houses were under construction, and there were also many vacant lots among the houses. This was the first thing I noticed when I entered that development. It was very lonely. There were even entire blocks I passed through that were completely abandoned, with only gray constructions and the occasional vacant lot. Finally, I reached the street where the house I was delivering to was located, but I found it strange that the further I went, the more I saw only unfinished houses. I didn't see any inhabited houses. I drove down the entire long block and arrived at the house number I had been given. It was a house that was almost finished. It already had doors and windows on the first floor, but it lacked windows on the upper floor and was not yet painted. It looked like a house that was still under construction. That's why it seemed strange to me that someone had ordered food to that place, and I began to think that maybe it was a prank, as it had happened to us before where we were sent to addresses and the owners would say they hadn't ordered anything. So that thought crossed my mind when I saw that house in that condition. I didn't even bother to get off my motorcycle. I turned it back on to leave, but then I saw someone open the door of that house. I was surprised when I saw a man come out wearing a dog mask. It seemed very strange to me since we were not even close to Halloween. It was actually summer, so it gave me a bad feeling. The man waved at me and then said he was the one who ordered the food, which, by the way, was a lot. There were 4 plates full of Chinese food. I got off the motorcycle and walked towards the guy to deliver the order, but then the man told me to wait at the door as he would go get his wallet. Suddenly, I saw someone else open the door, and it was another person wearing a pig mask. In the background, I saw a table full of people, all wearing masks of different animals, which were very disturbing. In the middle of the table, they had candles since the house still didn't have electricity. I swear that seeing that made my skin crawl. I started taking small steps backward as my whole body, my instincts were telling me that something was wrong and that I had to leave there as soon as possible. As I moved away, the man in the pig mask invited me to come inside and seriously asked why I was afraid of them. I couldn't respond. The fear wouldn't let me speak. Meanwhile, everyone at the table was laughing at me, mocking me. Suddenly, I heard a laugh coming from the upper floor of the house. It was the man with the dog mask who had come out initially, watching me from a window on the upper floor while mocking me. I dropped the food plates as best as I could and got on my motorcycle. As I tried to leave, I noticed they were chasing me, mocking me. They couldn't catch up with me as I accelerated as much as I could. Once I managed to get out of that development, I called the restaurant to report what had happened, but they did nothing. They didn't call the police until the next day after I pressured them. But the police found nothing. They only reported that the house was still unfinished and not inhabited, with no signs that anyone had been there, and there was no table as I had described. I never found out what happened with those people or what they were doing there, but I know it was nothing good, and I know I wouldn't be here telling you this if they had caught me. It was a very eerie scene. It really seemed like everyone was crazy, and the masks made it all even more disturbing. Today, I no longer live in that city. I don't know if that house is now inhabited, although I imagine it is since it's been several years. The only thing I know is that it left me with a trauma that I'm still working on in therapy. It helps me to share my story with people. It helps me not to feel alone in that aspect, and to vent about that horrible experience.